and she was one of the founding members of CBH, so we're happy to have her join us. She recently returned to Albuquerque after completing her doctoral degree in California, and she was born and raised here, graduated from Highland High School, and has received a degree in Community Studies and Anthropology from University of California, Santa Cruz. And as part of her undergraduate education, she completed an extensive 7-month ethnographic study on non-governmental organization run by and for people with HIV/AIDS. She returned to University of New Mexico for her master's degree in Latin American Studies. And her thesis was, she used a life history method to further elucidate the structural violence faced by organizers at Vivir con Dignidad, namely poverty, gender, and inequality, and homophobia. And we're very excited to have Melina joining us today. She recently completed her doctoral degree in anthropology, and it's very relevant to the work that we do here. It's focused on early psychosis, and she will take us on an exploration of her ethnographic study it was a joint degree with the University of California, San Francisco, and Berkeley. So I'm happy to hand it to Melina to take it away.
Thanks, Deb. As I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint, but as I do, I just want to say I'm so grateful to be here and to be invited to give this talk today. When I was planning grand rounds 10 years ago for the department, I never thought I would be giving one. So it feels truly amazing to be home, both back to New Mexico, but also back to this department that is a kind of home for me. It was so important in my development as a researcher and as an advocate in this field. And I'm so grateful to so many people who are currently on this Zoom for being really critical in the development of my thinking and my pursuit of this degree. So much gratitude. And as I reflect on the sense of returning home, I just want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk from my house in Albuquerque, which is on the homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, a fact that ties my sense of home to the land dispossession and endurance of Indigenous people throughout this community. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Is everybody seeing the presentation okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so the title of my talk is Not Yet Psychosis, an Ethnography at the Edges of Adolescence and Psychiatric Pathology. Relying on stories, as anthropology does, means that the structure of this grand rounds is likely going to be a little different than others that you've participated in, or at least that I have. So I wanted to warn you all that I'm going to be reading rather than presenting or displaying a lot of my data. That can be really hard for people to follow along. And so I've created a written version with accessibility features that you can ask in the chat, Deb Alshall, to email you, so that if it helps for you to track the conversation. The Edge of Teenage Boy. Colin came to the clinic because his mother wanted him to. He guessed it was the hearing voices, depression, and drugs, he said. He chose to start by talking about substance use, but then quickly turned to heartbreak. The drugs had started early, but the real trouble began when his girlfriend broke up with him in college. Colin told us, she had become disenchanted with me, but I was in love with her. He was devastated, stopped going to class so as to not see her. He speculated that she, like others, had gotten to know the real him and didn't like it. He said, when I open up to people, they don't like what they see. The voices started a little bit later, just narrating what was going on most of the time. He described them as mostly distracting. How do you deal with the distraction? The clinician asked. By plugging my ears, Colin responded. The voices that speak to him speak from an outside. They are not heard. They are heard, not thought. The voices talk about people talking about him. It occurred to me that they were the worst kind of friends. As the interview with Colin wrapped up, he mentioned plainly, Also, I should tell you, I'm very lazy. I don't really do anything. The resident asked if this was a change for him, and he responded, "That's the usual me." After leaving Colin's interview to talk briefly with his mother and sibling, the attending psychiatrist returned to the room where the rest of the team was discussing Colin's intake. The attending explained to the group that Colin's family had noticed a change in high school. He became extremely resentful and insulting, stopped helping with all the cleaning, left clothes around, stopped doing dishes. Realizing that his description was underwhelming those of us in the room, the attending urged us, "Most kids will do a dish. This is the edge of teenage boy." The comment places Colin on the edge of adolescence, an already edgy kind of place. His usual me, the laziness, heartbreak, risk-taking, and angst that contextualizes his life, exceeds the suffering widely associated with his developmental stage, but only by a rhetorical dish. If there's a single question at the root of this study, it is the one posed here. What marks the edge of teenage life, and when might this become a site for pathology? How can the suffering and transformation that is fundamental in contemporary understandings of adolescence be discerned from the suffering and transformation associated with early psychotic experience? How can psychiatric pathology be recognized within a space that is already characterized, at least in the West, as Margaret Mead and others would remind us, by storm, stress, torment, and risk? A space of emergence from the irrationality of childhood and transformation into the rationality of adulthood. And finally, how is life at the edge maintained? So today I'm going to present parts of an ethnography that I wrote for my dissertation. The ethnography is about young people and families seeking services in early psychosis clinics. Because of the clinical setting, it's also a work about psychiatric professionals who provide services in these clinics and the science that seeks to better understand early psychosis. I'll start with a brief overview of my study, taking some time to describe the anthropological approach and the ethnographic method. And then I'm going to frame early psychosis first through some common visual representations that are used in the field, and then through the perspective of two parents served by the clinic to provide a sense for how the field both develops and enacts diagnostic categories and concepts, and how families make meaning of them and contribute to that development and enactment. Then through this frame, I'll shift and highlight sociopolitical practices of silencing that I found riven through adolescence, psychiatry, and finally my own method. My talk today has three objectives. The first two I address directly by telling stories that relate to the edge of psychosis and to diagnostic ambivalence. Achieving the third objective will depend mostly on the impact of the stories that I tell you today, but also that you get a sense of what ethnography is. I'm assuming that for some of you, this will be new information, and so feel free to interrupt with any questions or necessary clarifications. It's a very different method and a very different approach to psychiatric concepts. So if you're unfamiliar with anthropology, you likely think of it as a discipline that studies faraway places with the goal of shedding light on the human condition through the perspective of an elsewhere or an otherwise. Often framed as a culture or a worldview, thinking with an otherwise helps avoid traps of ethnocentrism, essentially assuming that your common sense is the common sense. There is also a long legacy of in the study of psychosis and mental illness in anthropology, focused on the United States. It's a different kind of orientation to an otherwise. You may be familiar with the work of Gregory Bateson or Jules Henry, for example, whose work made important but albeit problematic contributions to family systems theory, or Sue Estroff's foundational work in outpatient care in the midst of deinstitutionalization in the Midwest. I apologize in advance for the font of this slide, but I just wanted to give you guys some citations in case you're interested. But anthropology approaches psychosis quite differently than psychiatry, less as a diagnostic fact and more as a contested and malleable sociocultural process for distinguishing otherness and living otherwise. This approach helps reveal how institutions constantly establish and reform notions of normative and pathological mental experience, and how these attributions are culturally influenced. It helps to elucidate the way experience of mental illness and the trajectory of its manifestation and impact are tied to sociocultural factors and subjective experience, demonstrating the relationship between psychotic experience or mental illness in general and things like political and economic disenfranchisement, social dispossession, racism, and political violence in post-colonial settings. My work builds on this robust scholarship that establishes mental illness as a complex and dynamic phenomena influenced by political, juridical, social, cultural, and psychological factors. What all of this work has in common is a use of ethnography, the primary method in sociocultural anthropology. Ethnography strives to better understand the human condition through sustained participant observation over long periods of time. The widely quoted rationale given here by Margaret Mead is that what people say, what people do, and what they say they do are very different things. So in order to capture a complex notion of what people do and say, in ethnography, you watch what people do, you watch people do things, you try to learn how to do things the way they do them, and you ask them about it. This dynamic approach lends to better understandings of complex sociocultural phenomena because it calls attention to the ways of being in the world that often go unnoticed or unremarked upon because they are taken for granted. The data you hear today was produced through ethnography. I conducted 12 months of fieldwork across 2 specialized early psychosis clinics housed in psychiatry departments at academic health centers in Western United States. I don't identify the clinics in order to protect the privacy of my study participants, especially given how small the early psychosis community is. Young people come to these clinics because someone suspected that they were experiencing, quote, early psychosis, a broad term meant to describe the period wherein a person has either just had a first episode of psychosis or is experiencing early warning signs in a risk period, originally called the Prodromal, which you'll hear a lot more about in this talk, and now more often referred to as clinical high risk, which you'll also hear about. During this fieldwork, I observed daily clinical operations, including team meetings, diagnostic interviews, medication management visits, family psychoeducation events, and therapy sessions. I also interviewed clinicians, trainees, as well as people and families receiving services in these clinics. Additionally, I conducted a series of interviews with clinicians at a 3rd clinic, similarly situated at a health science center at a university. These early psychosis clinics are part of an ongoing proliferation of psychiatric services for early psychosis in the United States, which your department is part of, so you might know a lot about. The clinics are aspirationally modeled after coordinated specialty care, a team-based recovery-oriented approach with an emphasis on engagement and psychoeducation. CSC gained significant traction recently, in part due to the rollout of the recovery after an initial schizophrenia episode, or the RAISE study, which I know you guys have heard about. Neither of the clinics I observed pursued or achieved CSC with fidelity, but they were influenced by the approach insofar as they strived for recovery orientation, relied on psychoeducation and evidence-based and promising interventions, such as medication management, multifamily and group therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis. They each used a team-based approach, which included psychiatrists, therapists, and trainees, but neither clinic included peer support workers, which is a critical component of the CSC model, and it demonstrated effective practice. The clinics also served a handful of individuals with more protracted mental illness that extended beyond a first episode and into a recovery stage of schizophrenia or other psychotic illnesses. Young people are typically offered 2 years of service, and depending on whether or not they meet inclusion criteria, they were also frequently recruited to participate in multiple research studies that were partnered with the clinic. So these studies offered access to diagnostic innovations or treatment innovations, as well as like nutritional and exercise programs, pharmaceutical trials, imaging studies, but also other kinds of studies, including my own. So my study was guided by two overarching questions. The first, how are various kinds of information exchanged between families and professionals in early psychosis clinics? And the second, how do new relationships and roles form between adolescents, parents, siblings, and service providers in these clinics? All right, so the first part, I'm going to just mark some space and describe early psychosis in a way that I think is different than we normally talk about it. So this section, early psychosis, just psychosis, and not yet psychosis. Early psychosis is often represented visually is within a stage model, such as the one featured here, depicting the natural history of schizophrenia. In these models, symptom experience is charted temporally, often by age, to visually represent the deteriorating course. Such models support the idea that a person on a psychosis trajectory whose symptoms are not detected or addressed will progress from having no or few symptoms of psychosis to having fleeting and or weak ones, to experiencing fully realized psychotic symptoms, and finally into a phase of chronic or residual illness characterized by compounding symptoms and functional disability. In this figure, early intervention, noted by the gray space, cuts into worsening symptoms, offering the possibility of thwarting the otherwise inevitable progression towards psychosis symptoms and or functional disability. Detection during the syndrome, chronic or residual phases promises to lessen worsening of symptoms, but detection and intervention in the prodromal stage offers the unique and time-limited possibility for preventing the course of the illness before a precipitous decline in health. Much debate exists in the field regarding whether the psychosis prodrome is a prodrome of any mental health disorder that involves psychosis or of schizophrenia specifically. As such, prodromal psychosis can be used in reference to a stage in a specific disease course, as it was in the visual above, but also in reference to a high-risk phase of various syndromes, as it is in this figure. No longer under debate is whether or not intervention is important in these stages. As you can see in the visual, there are two modes for intervention in early psychosis: prevention and treatment. In the observed clinics, the threshold between CHR and FEP was most often maintained by diagnostic determinations of conversion and assessment of the degree of conviction a psychiatric subject holds in relation to an idea or experience suspected to be a symptom of psychosis. Along with the less formal but widely recognized psychotic break, conversion implies a temporal point on a unidirectional process after which one cannot return to an earlier state, a permanent transformation. While common in the clinics, these notions of breaks, conversions, and intractable ruptures do not go uncontested. One psychiatrist lamented the use and implications of such language as he casually turned to me as we walked along the hall and said, "I hate it when people say psychotic break. I mean, what broke? Nothing." I'm interviewing a researcher who specializes in early psychosis. Interested in getting a scientific appraisal of this incipient edge of early psychosis, I ask, how do you think prodromal psychosis is different from normal adolescent experience? The researcher responds, I do believe in the continuum of psychosis. It is definitely true that children, adolescents, have more psychotic-like experiences than do other adults or just adults, but they don't have them with the same frequency or severity as someone who develops a prodrome. I ask, so what it sounds like from what I just understood is that you're talking about children. When you're talking about children, the kind of experience that they have is not so different from someone who is, the researcher interrupts me. That's right, children, not so different. Adolescents, it just starts to get more frequent. There's a normal distribution, right? So some people don't have this at all. Some people have some of these things, but it's infrequent, it's not bothersome, and it goes away over time. Or it sticks around their whole lives, but it doesn't really cause them any problems. But then when they start becoming more frequent and more severe, more impairing, more distressing, that's when you get on this path. The same as everyone has sadness, right? There's normal sadness and then there's depression. Or anxiety, the researcher continues, where everyone gets stressed out and anxious, but like does it start to turn into something else? Everybody has checked the stove once or twice in their life, right? Do you check it 10 times? Do you have to come back to the house afterward from somewhere else to make sure? Can't get the thought out of your mind? That's different. In this description, psychosis is a version of normal experience, but more severe, more impairing, and more distressing. But the researcher also introduces a temporal difference as well, in the delay of an afterwards. Concerns become symptoms of psychosis, not necessarily because they are categorically different than other types of concerns, but because they linger. They make demands for too long after any unnerving residual sensation should have resolved. They not only threaten return, as one would expect from something characteristically episodic, but symptoms of psychosis refuse the kind of dismissal that makes a subsequent possible. Identification of early symptoms then requires a consideration of psychotic experience from both the perspective of emergence and delay, as something impossibly both incipient and familiar. The researcher says, so I mean, everything is a continuum, all of these things, right? You can have a severe personality issue that is fun and quirky when it's mild and extremely problematic when it's severe. I ask for an example. The response, oh yeah, so my son says to me, there's nothing like having kids to help you understand this stuff. He tells me he sees a dead girl, that freaks him out. I ask, he's 9? This was probably when he was 7 or 8. And so I ask him about it and it scares him, it does, but it's not often, right? And I'm not worried about it unless it's still happening when he's 13 to some degree. If a hallucination is the perception of something that is not present, as any dictionary will tell us, the dead girl fits the bill. Even once you add the criteria that a hallucination, in order to qualify as something like psychosis, should cause distress, it still resonates. It isn't so much that this experience does not qualify as psychosis, but that such experiences are normal in childhood, or at least psychotic-like experiences. Not just that it is normal to experience psychosis in childhood, but rather that childhood perception and experience is in some ways psychotic. Psychosis from this perspective is then something we all grow out of, something we could all share. Seeing with reality is not given, it is learned, or at least developed, and it's supposed to be developed in adolescence. The researcher continued, when I think of how he doesn't want to go into the bathroom to brush his teeth by himself because the tree outside the window scares him, because it looks like there's a person out there or something, and no matter how many times I open the window and show him it's just a tree, I say, like a silhouette? Yeah. How does a 9-year-old brain make sense of visual images differently from a 13-year-old brain? I don't know. That's not my area. I think the perception is different, as well as the cognitive reality checking ability to see something, get a little freaked out by it, and go, okay, that's just a tree. So I think it's both. In this explanation, experiencing a shared reality is constituted not by accurately perceiving the material world, a silhouette of a tree as a silhouette of a tree, but rather through a limiting of possible perceptions. Psychosis then can be seen as a problem of filtering perceptual stimuli. It isn't so much not seeing reality, but rather seeing too much of it. What characterizes normal adolescent perception is actually no longer perceiving the person in the silhouette. Here, psychosis is discerned not in hallucination, a false vision, but rather in what an adolescent is unable to not see, what a child still could see. Early psychosis then becomes a consideration not only of new and emerging symptoms, but also of experience that becomes concerning because it endures, making the condition a question of onset, but also history. The edge emerges as we're kind of working through what the edge is. I would argue that it emerges as an ambivalent space where things like trustworthiness, curiosity, and ways of relating are carefully reestablished over and over through practices of worried hopefulness. Those caught up in it must walk the line between avoiding risk and allowing everything to become circumspect. In one interview, I asked Luz, a mother of a young man receiving services, if she thought her son was going to experience psychosis in the future. She replied, I don't know. I hope he doesn't. I think if he does, I hope he will find the kind of social institutional support to manage it. I can see him interested in exploring the edges. Interested in exploring the edges, I ask? she expanded, of a thought, of an object, of a sound. And so he walks in a very dangerous place. Even though the only diagnosis that Luz's son carries is depression, his curiosity at the edges becomes dangerous in light of psychosis risk. Perhaps curiosity is always dangerous. If the role psychiatry gives itself is, as Foucault and others have argued, to liberate us from unreason, Luz's role here is different. The clinic's task is to make her son understood through diagnosis and functional through treatment. She is grateful that they do this task well. But Luz has a different job: to protect her son's footing along the edge, to keep psychosis and its psychiatric rationalization from eclipsing the beauty of what their real world is, a world filled with debate, aspiration, sounds, and objects. In efforts to achieve this job, people and families seen in clinics work hard to make meaning of the complex and dynamic diagnostic concepts of early psychosis, like first episode psychosis, clinical high risk, these things. In the following two examples, parents offer alternative concepts, just psychosis and not yet psychosis, both of which refuse, I think, the intractability of psychotic illness. I'm sitting with Anna in a cafe. We are talking about her daughter who is in her early 20s. Her daughter was recently diagnosed with schizophrenia. She and her daughter are unconvinced of the diagnosis. She is telling me that when her daughter was first diagnosed with schizophrenia, it had made sense. Yes, it was like, this is what's wrong. Because when you do your own research, it's like, okay, here are the warning signs, and it manifests in your 20s, and you are withdrawn, you don't want to be around friends, you get depressed. And there were some things, but voices, that kind of thing, even when I was talking to her doctor, I told them she doesn't have any of these. They said, well, usually these manifest later when you're kind of talking to yourself and seeing things and hearing things. These come later, but she has depression and withdrawal. I asked, so when you walked away from that conversation feeling like this was what was to come? Yeah, that's what was going to happen to her, and it never did. And do you feel that way now? I ask. Yeah, no, not at all, she says. I trust her in the house. She goes to church on her own. The only thing I fear is when she just is worried about, am I doing the right thing? Am I saying the right thing at work? Did that just make sense, what I said to you, Mom? She's just very unsure of herself. It's almost like her insecurity is heightened to like 1,000, but that's as bad as it gets. I say, it's interesting. It's hard to get, and she interrupts me. I know. I stopped emailing the clinicians, but I'd be emailing. What about this? What about that? She just has this adamant, like, psychosis. Can she grow out of it? But it's like she grew into it. I don't know. If you can't tell me how or why, then you can't tell me it won't go away. I asked Anna why she had been emailing so desperately. And she says, tell me. Give me something that tells me what is happening with her. Because this is not, she didn't have anything traumatizing. She doesn't have the symptoms of schizophrenia. Then what is this? And it was just psychosis. Just psychosis. I take her to mean psychosis as a symptom that does not point to any cause or underlying disease. It gives her no indication of what's coming. She has an idea in her head of what schizophrenia would be, and this is not what her daughter is experiencing. Severed from its origin as only a symptom, psychosis lacks meaning to her. Anna finds a punishing diagnostic uncertainty here that both torments her and offers her hope. The clinicians had not been ambivalent. She was told that her daughter has schizophrenia, but they cannot tell her why or how. What seemed obvious to her at first becomes uncertain over time. Her critique is less about whether or not her daughter received the right diagnosis and more a refusal of its permanence. While just psychosis pushes against the stability of the schizophrenia diagnosis and its intractability, the next concept, not yet psychosis, refuses preemption as the only aim for a life at risk of psychosis. Mary and I had been talking about her daughter as a child. She tells me her daughter has always been a voracious reader. Read almost everything in the school library, she says. Then a pause as she returns to the present. And you know what is really sad? She is hardly able to read. I'm not sure what it's about, if it's distraction from the voices, being depressed. There's a lot of things, I think. But it's sad to see something that was so important to her kind of vanish. I could tell this loss went beyond cognition. Rather, it removed access to beloved worlds, to respite, and to joy. Wanting to imagine that the reading would come back, I asked Mary if she has hope that it will. She says yes and no. You know, in contrast to how I've lived most of the time, investigating everything, I've kind of just not investigated a lot with this so far. And I think, well, I don't know if it's good or not. I just haven't psychologically been able to do it. It just feels too difficult. I ask if it's the new diagnosis that they received of her daughter being CHR that scared her. She corrects me. Well, she doesn't have a diagnosis. She's just clinically high risk. I talked to the therapist today, in fact, and she was emphasizing the fact that she doesn't have a diagnosis because she doesn't have any psychotic episodes. She just has these voices, and they are very, very hard. She tells me that the article on her desk critiquing the prodrome as a concept is helpful because it further distances her daughter's voices from psychosis, especially from schizophrenia. In her assessment, the author shows how a prodrome seems to offer only the measly consolation that she has not yet converted, while risk as a concept maintains the possibility that it will be nothing. The not yet of the prodrome instantiates an ever-presence of potential psychosis. And yet, any comfort she gets from the idea that her daughter is just at risk seems to quickly dissipate as she is left acknowledging the very hard voices. She tells me that they never relent and are very critical. They talk all the time. The family works on befriending them, and it helps some of the time, but the new ones emerge, meaner ones, demanding new strategies. She tells me, I just worry about her getting worn out. I mean, there's only so much people can take. She will later tell me that the voices are getting worse, louder, and more aggressive. No diagnosis here does not mean no symptoms. From the beginning, Mary tells me the clinic's approach seemed to focus on determining whether or not her daughter had converted to psychosis. After determining that she was CHR, attention shifted steeply toward prevention. She recalls, I felt like we were just focused on, oh, please don't let her transition. And then I started to realize that never transitioning and just living with these voices could be hell. I mean, it could be its own totally horrible life. I do feel like there's a bit of an emphasis on that is what everyone is looking for. In light of this realization that never transitioning could be its own totally horrible life, I asked her if it still matters whether her daughter is CHR or if she converts to a psychotic disorder. She says yes, because it means that people will treat her differently when they see it. Her concern is not that her daughter receives an accurate diagnosis. In fact, she seems to know enough to refute that as a possibility. Her desire is to avoid a diagnosis that will impose more harm than it alleviates. In this way, she worries about a different kind of conversion, not of her daughter's state, but of her potential relationships. Her daughter is at risk here from both psychosis and the socio-emotional harms of psychiatric labels. Mostly, she's worried about what is being deprioritized or ignored. She explains that her daughter has other diagnosed mental health conditions, and it's just as if she says, it's as if they just don't even exist anymore, except that she's on medication. But it's been completely superseded by the high-risk stuff. Mary is concerned not only by the anticipatory logics that demand that she act on her daughter's potential conversion now, but also by what that demand displaces, the myriad other issues that distress her daughter, the other diagnosed conditions her daughter endures. Within this scene of not yet psychosis, Mary both fears and finds solace in her daughter's being at risk. It means her daughter does not have to live under the description of a psychotic disorder. People will not treat her differently yet, but it does not mean that her daughter's symptoms do not torment. It helps Mary to know that more and worse psychosis is not inevitable. CHR does not mean future schizophrenia, but being at risk cannot make the voices go away or make them more friendly. It has not brought the reading back. And it means other things are going unaddressed. It's a pretty horrible place, and as a not yet, it feels like forever. Mary says, in the family meeting, the psychiatrist repeatedly said not yet. He was being very careful, I think, just that I not think that there's no risk. And I say, and the issue with that concern is that the yet means that it's coming. And she says, well, it really made it sound that way. He wasn't saying if, he was saying it was almost like when. I ask Mary where she sees her daughter in 10 years. She says, I think about that, of course, and I have I have two pictures, but both seem very possible to me. One is the bleak one, which is that she will, well, I guess maybe there's three. Really bleak is that she wouldn't be able to stand this and she'll kill herself. I think that's always a possibility. The other would be that she stands it, but she's very dysfunctional and lives with us and has a very restricted life. And I can see her coming through it, whether she transitions or not. Mary's most bleak version, in which her daughter dies by suicide, corresponds not to a psychotic future, but rather to the highly distressing experiences in the space of the not yet psychosis. Preventing conversion is not enough. Hope for Mary seems to reside in some kind of transformation, an emergence from her daughter's current experience that may or may not include transitioning to psychosis. She does not wish to stay where they are. Rather, her hope is for getting beyond it, her daughter coming through it one way or another. Oops, sorry. I think I missed that slide. Now that we've established some underlying understanding of the dynamic and ambivalent edge of early psychosis from a new perspective, I want to turn our attention to how young people at this edge can go unheard, even as they are asked to account for their experience. In the following vignette, I detail an intake interview with a young woman I call Lucy. I hope to demonstrate that by founding diagnostic truth in literal description, there is a silencing or refusal of figurative expression, even though the figurative is foundational and perhaps the only possible way psychotic experience can be approximated. Lucy's intake interview began abruptly and casually. The medical student asked, "What did your therapist think you needed to talk to us about?" "The voices, I assume," she responded. Her tone was playful but sharp. She would not own the confusion. She told us that 3 months ago she had started hearing voices, saying, "It didn't feel right. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Does that make sense?" The medical student asks, "They were muffled?" "Yeah, muffled. Have you ever heard other voices that people didn't?" "I don't remember. I mean, I never asked people about that." Her response answered his question, but posed a new one. What would it be like to ask a person about that? The unanswered question hung heavy. The medical student followed up asking if anything else like this had ever happened, and Lucy mentioned the bugs. They crawl on her now and again. It had all started with the bugs. The student asks how they make her feel. "Like I need to take a shower," she responds. He continued asking questions about how she makes sense of the sensation that of bugs crawling on her when others do not perceive them. And Lucy told us it didn't really bother her when it started. When you're in 3rd grade, you just think everyone's seeing things. As with the dead girl in the tree, the understanding of her experience is extraordinary, manifests through development. It is not given. As a child, seeing the bugs didn't really bother Lucy. Now they make her feel dirty, like she needs to take a shower. The simile is immediately available. Only the simile is immediately available as actual bugs would make her feel. The bugs only become a potential hallucination in hindsight and from the position of learned rationality that considers them alongside bugs that other people experience. It is growing up that imposes the recognition of her experience as extraordinary. And it is from the position of this learned rationality that the space of the simile must be imposed. She must come to understand that these experiences are real as experience, but they are not real bugs. A resident took the interview over from the medical student. Lucy patiently recounted some experiences in high school when she had some thoughts of hurting herself. The resident asked her more about how she felt during that time. Lucy responded, "I don't think I had a plan. My best friend was not talking to me. Things were out of my grasp." The resident clarified, "Like literally out?" Interrupting her, Lucy said dismissively, "No, metaphorically." In a psychosis clinic where things being out of my grasp has literal possibilities and implications. Weakness, trembling, stiffness are all potential symptoms, as well as possible medication side effects that must be psychiatrically parsed. But in this case, possible psychosis perverted a common use of a common expression. It rendered it literal. Lucy seemed disappointed as she qualified it, like I wasn't ready for high school. Her description had been drained of its power, its resonance, and its truth. She contextualized her difficulty starting school as a result of worry. The clinicians asked what she was worried about. Lucy said, that they would see through me, that I wasn't a normal kid. The resident said, "Do you think other kids see you that way?" She responded, "I don't think anyone even noticed I was in class." She was afraid her peers would see her would see that she was abnormal, but it ended up that they were seeing all the way through her, not to an underlying oddness, but rather insofar as she felt completely unnoticed. Lucy told us that she was not sure why, but something had shifted at the end of the year and she'd started feeling unsafe. I'm not sure how to describe it. I just felt scared all the time. Now, it was all in my mind. How long did it take you to realize that it was coming from your mind? Lucy said, 2 months, with a little smile. Voices were talking to her all the time, and they were mean. As the clinical team gathered to make a plan, the attending psychiatrist said he wasn't picking up on anything like conviction. He referenced her response that she was 50% sure that the voices are real. And the therapist who interviewed Lucy's mother agreed that Lucy lacked conviction, saying that she had been receptive to reality testing. It is not misperception that indicates conversion to psychosis here, but an inability to know it as such. The team brought Lucy and her mom back into the room and began by introducing the prodrome, describing it as a scientific advancement over the last 10 to 15 years that attends to the early manifestations of psychosis. Distinguishing the prodrome from full psychotic episode, the psychiatrist explained that the transition to full psychosis is marked not by the presence of experiences such as voices, but rather in a, quote, loss of insight about them not necessarily being real. Diagnosis, he said, comes when we can convince ourselves that you have reached that point. That point is conversion. In this diagnostic process, the clinician is not only required to notice symptoms, but also the degree to which the patient was convinced that what she experienced, thought, or believed was real. Conversion then requires double conviction, that of the patient and the diagnostician. The psychiatrist then offered the family a SIPS, a gold standard scientific instrument for assessing prodromal psychosis. Lucy would have to enroll in a research study to be able to get access. He said that the results could, quote, help you with what you say to docs in the future. The instrument here promises double recognition, the instrument's recognition of symptoms, and also the future doctor's recognition of Lucy. The test would help Lucy with her biography. Lucy remains in an at-risk stage precisely because she claims the voices, bugs, fears, and ideas as at least partially her own, of her world, not the world. But taking such ownership does seem to take a toll. The voices, her voices are not real as reality or symptom. Her understanding of them as not real helps her to maintain her sovereignty of self, and yet the experiences remain. They distract, torment, and exclude her. They make her socially invisible. They foreclose life chances as she has to drop out of school. Lucy tells me later that she's glad to not have psychosis, glad to be just at risk. Such is the position of not yet psychosis, an ambivalent place on the periphery of psychiatry, where maintaining an intimate relationship to fleeting and attenuating psychotic experiences, seeing them as of your world, of your own world, is seen as negating the full-blown psychosis. Maintaining the space of the simile requires that she takes ownership over her misperceptions. Beyond the specifics of pre-psychosis, the practice wherein uncertain diagnoses are stabilized in psychiatry has been long criticized by anthropology, critiqued by anthropology, and from within psychiatry itself. Less well addressed are risks associated with disabusing or refusing to authorize an experience as a symptom. It is widely assumed that people do not want to hear that they have psychosis. My interviews categorically confirm that young people and family members are generally relieved to learn that they are just at risk. And yet, interviews also consistently show that this relief is tempered by the ongoing presence of psychosis in their lives, experiences that are often highly distressing, but refused what Sue Estroff calls the shelter of a disease designation. Potential symptoms of psychotic illness are disqualified as such when a person maintains doubt in their experience. But maintaining such doubt is itself a punishing and by all accounts exhausting endeavor. If conversion to psychosis is determined by the point at which a person stops doubting their experience, it seems important to better understand not only how to mark that threshold, but also what the doubting feels like. If Lucy learns to doubt her own experience from a position within it as something that she owns, who is doing the doubting and who is under doubt? There is a burden to the demand that reason makes on our attitude towards unreason. If preventing psychosis means asking young people to stay in a position of doubt relative to their perceptions of the world, it's important to know what is being asked of them. In efforts to protect them, young people are being asked to describe their experiences, but with limited forms of expression, requiring them to speak without offering the possibility of being heard. I'm going to skip through a little bit of anthropology theory. And just quickly, okay. So if we look to early psychosis not as an early stage in a disease model, but rather as a kind of interstitial space where people are interacting with their experiences in these complex ways, it provides a gap where discourse with psychosis, with something like psychotic experience, remains possible. And if we do that, figurative expression becomes essential to the task of both description and self-actualization. And yet, within the language of the diagnosis and intervention, description primarily operates according to its literal inferences. The stakes are too high for misperception, misinterpretation, and actualized harm. Psychiatry needs to know if there are tremors, if there is actual abuse, if someone's thoughts make them dangerous. And yet, I argue that there are stakes in silencing or refusing the figurative. Young people go unheard, unseen, they suffer alone, they are forgotten, and it feels like forever. Psychiatry is, of course, not the only culprit. I'll end today with a vignette of how my own research practices threatened a similar kind of erasure. William is one of a handful of people who goes to the clinic to get antipsychotic medication via a clinician-administered shot. He carries a diagnosis for a fully realized psychotic disorder, but continues to access services through the clinic. When I ask why he uses an injectable, he says he prefers it that way. I wouldn't want to be psychoanalyzed. After his monthly visit, we chatted about things we had in common: college, not playing frisbee golf, or Dungeons and Dragons. I asked him if anything had happened since the last time we met. He replied no. He had said that he thought he had had a hallucination, but his psychiatrist had said it wasn't one. He had heard a song and thought it was singing right to him, addressing him directly. I asked him if the song I asked him if it had been upsetting. He said, not really. I asked what it had said. He paused for a second, explained that it had said something like that it hadn't given up on him. It was nice. How does it make you feel that your psychiatrist doesn't think it's a hallucination? Disappointing, I guess, he responded. He continued, if it had been a hallucination, it would have been, quote, more real instead of something I'm imagining, end quote. I asked him if he knew why his psychiatrist didn't think it was a hallucination, and he said it's because it didn't last very long. I asked, do you think he was right? It doesn't feel the same way it used to, so I guess so. William's disappointment poses a kind of paradox. At once, I recognize the psychiatrist's move as an effort towards normalization, an intervention on the patient's interpretation of an experience as pathological or abnormal. Within the context of early psychosis clinics, such acts of depathologization can precipitate lowering a dose of antipsychotics. They can shift treatment considerations away from crisis management to stabilization, even toward recovery. The refusal to authorize the symptom is in some ways a refusal of schizophrenia's chronicity, and the over-determining way, once cast as a diagnosis, psychosis seems to explain everything. It is an attempt at care. And yet, this time the intervention did not seem to have the intended effect. It had produced rather than alleviated distress, a disappointment. The experience was too brief to qualify as a symptom. Psychiatric rationalization could not save William from the possibility that his experience was not real. Instead, the psychiatrist's refusal to authorize the experience as a hallucination offers the radically unsettling possibility that one can experience something that is neither a symptom of psychosis nor a product of reality. Neither was it a loss of madness, an entirely different kind of madness. The source of William's distress was difficult at first to see. It was not a loss of reality to unreason. Being addressed was not itself distressing. Neither was it a loss of unreason to psychiatric rationalization. Having it declared a hallucination would have been fine. The disappointment seems to stem not from the way the symptom secures unreason as not real, but rather from how it secures his real as not mad. The song's address itself had been nice, but made less real, it lost its valence as an entity. It became neither a reinforcing presence nor a symptom of psychosis. It becomes just a figment of his imagination, fiction. For William, there is no possibility for the song's address outside of his psychosis. The song cannot speak directly to him. Without being a hallucination, the source of the address becomes nothing, and one cannot be addressed by nothing. William cannot experience unreason without becoming psychotic. William and I met up again a few weeks later for an interview. I knew from our previous conversations that he had experienced debilitating paranoia. I carried that knowledge into the informed consent process. I anticipated paranoia. I knew to be especially sensitive in my explanation of data procedures. I assumed he would be concerned. Carefully, I detailed all the ways I would distance him from his data, by code, by firewall, by password. Finally, I talked about pseudonyms, and he glanced up to make eye contact with me and said, "But you will remember my name, won't you?" My heart sank as I reassured him that I would, even as I struggled to remember what it was and found, just for a second, only his code. It strikes me that, as with other processes of limiting I discussed earlier, like adolescence or in constraining narration to its literal forms, my attempts of preempting a reasonable threat, a human subject's threat, filtered so much information out of what I was seeing that there was barely anything left at all. I had protected him to the point of not being able to recognize him, and he caught me. In the name of institutional ethics, I had replaced his name with a code when what he really wanted to be was recognized, remembered. We all must listen better. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible, Melina. And we would like to open it up. We have about a little less than 10 minutes for any questions, but thank you for sharing your wisdom. It was amazing.
So grateful.
Questions?
This is more of a comment and a question. Melina, it was thrilling to hear your talk. And
thank you.
You just model so being present with someone and listening so carefully. Your incredible humanity and empathy is, and the way that you could analyze it and speak of it, and the way that you ended was so incredibly moving. I hope that everybody here who's in traditional forms of treatment can take a little bit of the way that you are so present with people and carry it into their work. It's inspirational, Melina. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. Coming from you, that's an incredible compliment. I think much of my listening skills were actually developed in conversations with you over many decades, or a little over a decade.
So I have a question, Melina, and more like a comment, as Avi said. So it's so touching to hear you.
I love you.
And to have you come back and be who you are. Because, you know, we work in such stratified environments, and you didn't come to us as a doctor, but at first, you came to us as a ma, meaning masters and mother. And then you came back to us now as such as a thinker and a feeler that we have to take a big breath and learn from. So I want to thank you for that. So I wonder what your next steps are, because there has to be a next step about what do you do with this, not only with the information you have, but the framework you use to get the information. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Helene. It's so wonderful to be back. And it isn't like, I think my trajectory, I don't think that I could have listened quite the way that I did in this ethnography or done this ethnography successfully had I not had this untypical educational approach. So I think that what I'll take from what you're saying is not only that I think I consider people on untraditional trajectories as really valuable to like academia. And I think one next step is to really work hard to make spaces for folks who don't take typical trajectories. And so getting a PhD as a mom and returning is untypical, and I hope other people do weird stuff too. So one step is that I'm really committed to helping that, to getting new voices in. This work really taught me about how adolescents are often an object of study, but they're very often not listened to in a real particular way. And so I think my next step for research will probably expand out to thinking more through how to listen to the extraordinary ideas and thoughts of young people. And you and I, maybe you should give me some career advice for next steps in the other way. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Okay.
Seems to me like you could choose to stay within psychiatry, or you could expand what you're doing to be listening in general. I mean, we certainly live in a world now where listening is not so easy. So it just made me think that, will you stay within the world of mental health, or will you look at a broader array of being unheard, broader arrays of being unheard?
Yeah, I mean, circling back to my original, like my entry into this talk, as I was thinking about, it as a homecoming, I really see psychiatry as kind of home for me. I don't see myself leaving mental health research, maybe going onto its like periphery. But I think one of the special things about this strange trajectory is that I can bring anthropology into a psychiatric frame. Those two, they sometimes don't talk well together. So I'm hoping that I can continue kind of in that work.
There's a historical, I'm sorry, I want to have a dialogue with you in some way.
Lifelong.
Lifelong. There's a historical connection between psychiatry and anthropology. And in this department, since I'm so historically around so long, there were times when we had attending psychiatrists in the department. Joan Koss and others were actual, vital members of the department, but that focus really changed. So I wonder why. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah, we should talk about that more. I mean, one of the most famous medical anthropologists is Arthur Kleinman, and he's also a psychiatrist. And so there's lots of these examples of people who have had a connection to anthropology, and anthropology had a big impact on ethnopsychiatry and culturally bound symptoms and family systems theory, as I alluded to. So there's a complex history. I just didn't want to get into it too much, but not everybody has a twin anthropologist too. So you may have a special.
That's true. Have special access, right?
I think we may have time. Thank you for one more question. And I noticed a few people had turned on their screens, so I'm wondering if there was another question.
Well, I do have a question. Can you turn your, I'm sorry. I couldn't help but think while you were talking that so much of what you're saying, which is wonderful, is very philosophical. Was philosophy, was that part of your training too, and one of the tools that you brought to this inquiry?
It's a very generous question. I have to say,
Can you hear?
Oh, can you hear? Oh, sorry.
Go on. I'm sorry, Avi turned off the audio, so I didn't hear what you just said, Melina.
No, it's fine. It's complicated family dynamics. Yep. So it's a very generous question, really, because this strange trajectory into graduate school meant that I didn't actually have the kind of philosophical training that many graduate students in anthropology and at Berkeley have. But when I got there, one of the things that was really incredible was learning from others who had had that trajectory. And so I bring in a lot of Black studies theory, critical race theory. I use a lot of structural violence theories, and anthropology does sort of our theoretical orientations do use a lot of philosophical concepts like Searle and phenomenology and those kinds of things. So we are thinking a lot about ontology, and so we can think through kind of worldviews through these different philosophical lenses in really, I think, productive ways. So my thinking is definitely influenced by that.
The questions that you asked your patients were very deep. I mean, there was nothing superficial about it. Every single one of them just seemed to dive right into the really core issues. Thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Well, we're so glad that so many people were able to turn to this conversation today. And Dr. Salvador, we are so proud of you, this incredible study. We want to hear more and more and more about it. So we're going to invite you back to talk to us, I know, at CBH. And just thank you so much for sharing this incredible ethnography with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me and for your patience with this a different format.
Thanks, everyone.